Key to Life.
Hello, this is Sekou Burmese, your host of The Lit Review, a podcast brought to you by the Academy of Management Journal. In this episode, I speak with Rachel Dailey Goodwin, Assistant Professor of Management at Syracuse University in the Whitman School of Management. In our conversation, we explore her recent AMJ article on perfectionism, an issue I think deeply embedded in the realities of modern organizational life. The paper is a fascinating study about the world of professional ballet, a place where the stakes are high, standards are extreme, and there is a constant pressure to be flawless. The paper argues that perfectionism isn't just a personality trait. It's shaped, activated, and amplified by the social cues we experience at work. And those same dynamics that push dancers either towards burnout or to develop resilience also show up in consulting firms, hospitals, tech companies, academia, pretty much anywhere high performers are expected to deliver under constant scrutiny. So in our conversation, we'll talk about what perfectionism looks like in everyday organizational life, why high achievers often shift between the good and bad forms of perfectionism, and most importantly, what leaders, mentors, and peers can do to create environments where people can strive for excellence without sacrificing their well-being. I hope that you will enjoy this episode of The Lit Review and my discussion with Rachel Dailey Goodwin. My guest today on the Lit Review podcast is Rachel Dailey Goodwin. She is the Assistant Professor of Management at Syracuse University in the Whitman School of Management. Her research investigates obstacles working women encounter in their leadership pursuits, including power to lead in majority male domains, perfectionism, and gendered construal stereotypes. Hello, Rachel, and welcome to the Lit Review podcast.
Hello. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
The pleasure is all mine. Well, I'm glad you're here joining us as we discuss a recent AMJ paper that you published with your co-authors entitled Under Pressure to Be Perfect: How Dehumanizing and Rehumanizing Social Cues Lead to Maladaptive and Adaptive Perfectionism. And I read this paper and abstract and I said, well, we have to have someone like this on this because I need this. You know, forget my audience members. I need this. But before we get into the paper, I always like to ask, what got you interested in this topic of perfectionism?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So when I spent a lot of time dancing when I was younger, and I just loved ballet. So I thought it'd be super interesting to interview professional ballet dancers. You know, like these were my role models growing up, you know, they're like my heroes. So I took a personal interest to the context of professional ballet, but perfectionism actually it wasn't what I thought we would be investigating. It wasn't what any of us thought we would be investigating. So our research team originally entered the ballet context for different reasons. For example, we were interested in relationships and relational dynamics and diversity issues. Lyndon Garrett, a co-author on the paper, does a lot of work on, relationships. And Ali Block, who's a professional dancer and was also one of our co-authors, she had other things that she was interested in as well. So perfectionism wasn't really something that we thought would come out of this. But in these interviews, right, when we asked questions about relationships or when we asked questions about diversity issues, right, particularly, how, inclusion and representation played out in these environments, dancers kept returning to this theme of overwhelming pressure to be perfect, right, and to conform, right? And so as they talked about kind of these expectations on, not only their physical bodies, but also their behavior, their demeanor, how they were even like their emotional control, right? Or their sense of self-worth, like perfectionism emerged pretty early as a core theme of how they kind of, one of the obstacles that they were trying to navigate. So perfectionism wasn't our initial topic, but the data led us there.
I love a good emergent phenomenon, something that just shows itself in plain sight. And that's great. All right, so let's dive into the paper. So what were, I guess, your central findings?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first, I think it's important to mention that there were different types of perfectionism that manifested in our data. So in our early interviews, many of the dancers described maladaptive perfectionism, which is driven by a set of perfectionistic concerns or, self-criticism, obsessive fear of making mistakes, and it's kind of anchored these dancers' self-worth in their accomplishments. So some of these we heard this over and over again from so many dancers that we interviewed, but then some of them also described how their focus or their experience of perfectionism kind of evolved different times, and they described experiencing more adaptive perfectionism. And so, we define this in our paper as characterized by the pursuit of excellence or, perfectionistic strivings rather than perfectionistic concerns. So it still involves a focus on really, really high standards and achieving high standards, but it's rooted in more of this growth mindset, and it's not characterized by such unhealthy behaviors and negative self-talk and self-thoughts that tend to be intertwined with really destructive behaviors like maladaptive perfectionism is. So we were really interested in unpacking kind of what it was in the environment that was driving these different types of perfectionism. And our work provides several important findings. So I'll share just a quick summary of kind of 4 key takeaways, and then we can dive a little bit more into each of these with like some other questions. But the first one is like we're linking dehumanization and rehumanization to perfectionism to better understand what in these high pressure to perform environments leads to different types of perfectionism. So we identify organizational dehumanization, right, as kind of an underlying contextual mechanism that drives maladaptive perfectionism, and whereas rehumanization, right, some of these rehumanizing cues that coworkers might give as kind of a contextual mechanism for adaptive, or at least perfectionism that seems to be described as more adaptive.
Let me, if I could,
right
now, just so.
Tell me anytime.
So maladaptive, adaptive, dehumanizing, rehumanizing. Can you give an example? Like what does that mean? I think we have an understanding, but I always find we think we know something until we really dive into it, and then we realize, oh, that actually means something else. So the humanizing aspect.
Right. So, for example, some ballet dancers with harmful tendencies talked about how their companies discouraged questions and reminded them that they were replaceable and only had 1-year contracts. Others talked about how they experienced or even experimented with kind of dangerous behaviors like dancing through injuries or starving themselves or isolating themselves because they were afraid to make a mistake in front of people. So they were trying to go for this like really unattainable ideal that they knew they couldn't make, right?
So
that's kind of where the fear comes in of like, oh, I've got to be super, super perfect. I'm afraid to make these mistakes. But then there were others that talked about how they could embrace making mistakes while still maintaining these high standards. And they, talked about how in their environments, agency was encouraged, individuality was celebrated, emotions could be embraced, right? Making mistakes could be like a learning opportunity. It didn't feel like we were on the chopping block. So hopefully those are some examples that.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. So, I mean, the idea you are replaceable, you are not uniquely qualified, that's dehumanizing. And I think we can all remember a time we've been in an organization where we felt, all right, if I wasn't here, they just pull someone else in and do my job. So, what unique thing do I have? Do they see my humanity? Do they see how hard I'm trying? So that's great. Okay. All right. I stopped you in the middle of it. You
no.
Continue with your key takeaways.
So like the 4 specific forms of dehumanizing and rehumanizing cues that we use in the paper are denial of subjectivity, denial of agency, denial of fallibility, and denial of individuality. So, and then rehumanizing cues have to do with those same 4 factors, right? Yeah. You can help people embrace their subjectivity, agency, fallibility, and individuality. This is by no means a complete list, right? Okay. For example, objectivity isn't in there, right? And it could be, right? That's definitely a dehumanizing cue that I thought we would hear more about, but dancers understandably didn't really want to talk about how they were sexually objectified. So, there are definitely factors of dehumanization and rehumanization that could, be expanded or added to this. Okay. But we started with these, and I think they're a great place to build off of, right? Yeah. So it's just identifying that these specific forms of dehumanizing and rehumanizing social cues are cues for different types of perfectionism. Yeah. So people can shift back and forth between these different types of perfectionism. That's another key finding that, we actually collected qualitative and quantitative data for this paper. The quantitative paper, I think is still forthcoming. The quantitative data didn't make it into this for good reasons. But I think it's there. We do have the data to show that people do go back and forth. In addition to several quotes in our interview data that are in this AMJ paper that talk about how people are going back and forth between these different forms of perfectionism based on their cues in their environment, right?
Okay.
And then finally, I think the last key contribution is that we offer a cyclical and iterative view of perfectionism. So our model talks about how maladaptive and adaptive perfectionism are characterized by cycles. Now, there are other scholars that also talk about, how perfectionism can be cyclical, right?
Yeah.
But we kind of take that one step further, and we talk about how dehumanizing cues and different forms of perfectionism are cyclical, right? And so these cycles of mutually reinforcing cognitions and behaviors are really important to understand if you're wanting to try to get shift employees from maladaptive to adaptive perfectionistic experiences, particularly in high pressure to perform environments, which is really where I think we'll see work, branching out from this work in those spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I wanted to go next, which is I love the context of the professional ballet. I think, my daughter right now dances. She's in ballet. I think all the time about she's 12. So it's, still very much a fun time with her friends. But I know this thing can get serious, and a lot of the stuff you're talking about, I've also seen Black Swan, the movie. So, I have all the the tropes in my mind. But the generalizability of what you're talking about, I think, is important. And so there are a lot of corporate cultures now that are consider themselves high performance, right? Where an error would create a really bad problem. You think some people are dealing with life or death. Some people are dealing with people's livelihoods. Some people are dealing with kids. Some people are dealing with large sums of money. So how do you see, what parallels do you see between kind of what your context in ballet and some of these other, high performance cultures?
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of parallels to answer this question academically. I think first I need to unpack what a high performance job looks like. And, to do that, we need to go back and define performance pressure. So in our paper, we use two definitions. The first one comes from Baumeister, from some of his work that's a little bit older, 1984 paper, where he talked about the performance pressure as being any factor or combination of factors that increases the importance of performing well. And then a second definition that we used, because we didn't feel like any one of these definitions really encapsulated the phenomena that we were capturing, but the second definition that we used to kind of integrate with that first one was from Mitchell and colleagues 2018, where they defined performance pressure as the urgency to achieve high performance levels because performance is tied to substantial consequences, which is what you just shared, right?
Okay.
So these definitions combined highlight the demanding and high stakes nature of performance pressure at work, where mistakes can have significant consequences related to career advancements or job security, right? There's a long list, I think, that we could dive into. But for the sake of time, high performance pressure occupations generally involve significant rewards or penalties, right? As a consequence of failing to obtain hard to achieve outcomes. And these could involve emotional or physical or mental labor, right? Like all of that. It could be demanding long hours, high productivity levels, with this expectation to be always on. In fact, I think a lot of our listeners could probably relate to this, right? There are several industries, consulting, finance, medicine, academia, tech, that tend to operate with this kind of always on culture, and where people feel like, oh, I'm, always being evaluated, and I've got to work these long hours. I've got to meet my tight deadlines, and there's very little room for error, right? So like ballet dancers, I think there are a lot of employees out there in these high pressure to perform environments that are feeling like they have to perform and appear tireless, flawless, and endlessly composed, right? At the same time. It's a lot. So one example that I give is doctors, right? Doctors must perform medical procedures with precision. Sometimes, even under life-threatening circumstances, or especially under life-threatening circumstances. Tenure track professors, right? We are expected to, I'm sure we've all heard this, like publish or perish, right?
Yep.
Emergency and military personnel, or like especially people who are in combat roles, they often encounter really kind of high risk and stressful situations that I would say are, with high pressure to perform. And then this year, I think we can add to the list college and university administrators, right? I mean, especially with, the current administration, I think they could definitely resonate with the words under pressure, right? Whether it's tariffs or negotiations or protests or educational policies that are constantly changing and all the uncertainty in the environment, AI, right? I think there's just a ton of pressure right now that leaders are experiencing in a lot of different fields. So just to be clear, we didn't test our model in any of these other contexts that we're talking about, right? We now there is one other qualitative paper that was already published discussing our model and how it fits so well within the academic context. So that's a good start, right? But I would love to see other scholars test pieces of our model or, the full model in some of these other high pressure to perform contexts.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think in particular, if you think about the use of social media, the way media is now, a mistake that you make that might have gone unseen 10 years ago now is seen. People are all seeing it. They're looking at it. Public officials are looking at it. You say something in class, it's recorded. So there is a view of, well, if I slip up, there's a chance that a slip up could lead to some really negative consequences. And so I think more and more we're finding the high performance definition that you talked about to just encapsulate more and more roles that we didn't see before. So I wanted to also pivot to talk about the cues, because one of the big kind of gaps I think you're pushing on this is you're challenging this view that perfectionism is a trait. Right, that there are people like, I'm a perfectionist. The old adage, like, and
they wear it as a badge of honor, like, I'm a perfectionist.
What's your weakness? Oh, I'm a perfectionist, and it just, it's like the worst interview answer ever. But what you and your colleagues are talking about is, well, perfectionism isn't necessarily a trait. There are situational cues, and so this is where we talked about humanizing, dehumanizing, and so. Thinking about modern organizations, and I think you spoke a little bit about this before, but are there other sorts of more generalized cues when you think of dehumanizing and rehumanizing? You mentioned the you're replaceable piece, which I think a lot of people can relate to. Are there one or two others that you think maybe are most common? I don't know how you are, but when I start studying something, I see it everywhere. And so maybe there are things that you see in a lot of places. So what kind of cues?
Yeah. So just to back up real quick, I want to make it clear. We're not saying that perfectionism is not a trait, right? We're building to the literature that suggests that perfectionism is a trait. And we're also claiming that perfectionism can be state-like. So do I think that a lot of the professional ballet dancers that we interviewed have trait-like perfectionism? Absolutely, right? I think we self-selected sample of people who are dealing with trait perfectionism. And I think that it's exacerbated by cues in the environment, right? So I don't think it has to be an either or. I think it can be both. And then as to your question about, rehumanizing and dehumanizing cues, I think there's 4 that our paper really focuses on. And again, like there could be more that we could add to this list, but we focus on the denial of agency. And that's the first one that we kind of go into. And this involves having your voice or your opinions or your needs shut down, right? And so to cue, like the rehumanizing cue for agency would be, opening your door and allowing for those opinions and, needs to be shared. So an example from our data would be when a dancer tried to express their opinion or tried to clarify a step in a rehearsal and the ballet master shut them down, right? I think there are a lot of people in corporate that could relate to that, right? Where they came up with an idea, right, that was kind of shut down really quickly. And I think that this happens frequently within high pressure to perform organizational settings, or more frequently than we wish it would. Another cue, a dehumanizing cue in our data that one of the factors that we focused on was the denial of individuality. So this involves situations where you're cued to conform, and not just conform, right? Like we're not saying to conform is always a bad thing, right? But it's when you're cued to conform at a cost to your human needs or values. So a lot of the dancers we interviewed described feeling the need to conform to a particular aesthetic or try to match, other dancers in ways that were kind of harmful to their identities, like Black dancers wearing white tights and pink toe shoes instead of having something that matched their aesthetic, right? Or feeling that, they needed to eat a certain way or not eat, right? So to conform to this, figure. So they described feeling like they had to conform in these ways that were kind of harmful, or really harmful in some instances. And I think that we can, relate to a lot of the dancers that said they also felt like, they were stifled in having to dress a certain way, right? Like everyone has to wear the black leotard and the pink tights. And some offices have dress codes that can also kind of minimize our individuality, right?
Sure.
Hairstyles or whatnot, behave a certain way, blend in, so denying individuality versus embracing individuality is another one of the, kind of factor of cues that we focused on. The third factor was dehumanizing by denying subjectivity. So this involves kind of checking your bags at the door, right? Disregarding your emotions or your physical pain, right? Like, I remember, hearing from dancers, this experience of like, as soon as you enter the studio or as soon as you enter, the workspace, right? Like, I want you to let go of everything that happened before that or anything, and I could relate so well to that when I was dancing. That was like beat into us, right? So, being expected to push through injury or tough emotions without sharing them with your coworkers, right? Or being accused of being weak and not tough enough, right? If you couldn't work the extra hours or if you couldn't work through that injury, right? Like, I think this culture of mental toughness is oftentimes harmful to our humanity, right? To our health, our wellness. And so, cueing others around you to embrace those things, right? Like, take a break, right? Like, it's normal to take a break. It's normal for us to run out of energy or to need, food or rest, right? Like, you can rest on the weekends. I think the last one is denial of fallibility. So this involves a disregard for the fact that people are human and that they are going to make mistakes, right? Like, none of us are robots. We're not machines. Some of us are being replaced by machines right now, but there should be room in organizations, unfortunately, right? There should be room in organizations for people to learn from mistakes, and humanity should be valued and embraced. So, like, that's one of the takeaways from this research, right? Is that you can value humanity and still expect a high level of performance. And people will avoid breakdowns that way. If we expect them, if we're cueing them to deny these human needs over and over again, right, then they eventually break down. And that's not good for them. It's not good for the organization. So we heard that some dancers also moved to other companies where they thought they would find better environments or environments that could cue them to rehumanize. And they use their agency that way to rehumanize. But hopefully that gives you an idea of cues out there that could be dehumanizing or rehumanizing that could affect the type of perfectionism that people experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to be a little bit of a devil's advocate as I ask my next question, because I hear everything that you're saying. I'm going to put on my former, corporate person hat and say like, hey, humanity is important, XYZ, but we got a product to make. We have a service to provide. Our customers expect really high quality. Right. How do I prepare people to execute at a very high level if these cues that you're telling me about, like, hey, you got to kind of work through things and you have to, become the role that you're playing in this organization when you come in, and you have to leave your bag, that whole leaving your bag by the door when you come in. Right. That's what people say that's professionalism, right? Is that you don't bring that in, right? So I'm devil's advocate. I saw your reaction. Devil's advocate. So my question couched in that is, if for our leaders out there who are thinking about, all right, I want to set high standards, but I would love to avoid maladaptive perfectionism amongst my people, the burnout, the spin out, how do we toe that line? Because obviously we're going for high performance, but we also want to avoid maybe some of this spiraling.
Yeah. So I think that's a very good question. And to be honest, our data was not chock full of very many leaders who did this very well,
Okay.
right? It was mostly the coworkers or the other dancers who were affirming and, helping their, struggling coworkers to come out of these maladaptive spirals of perfectionism. So I think future research is needed to empirically test what you're describing. However, that being said, we did interview a few leaders. That data also didn't make it into the paper. This was like a 200-page paper, and they kept saying, "Pare it down,
this
pare
is
it down,
this
pare
is
it down."
good. I'm getting the director's cut stuff here. You give it to me. Let's go.
Right. So we did interview leaders. We felt like a lot of the leaders were good at promoting themselves and saying like, "Oh, and we're doing this, so well in our company," and we weren't sure if that was accurate or if that was how it really was. Right. That being said, in those interviews, they did say that when people are reminded that they're valued beyond their output, they pursue excellence more sustainably. Right. So if you pair high expectation with a high focus on humanity, you're going to get people who don't want to leave, right? You're going to get people who feel valued, who want to continue to raise the bar for you, right? Because they feel like you really value them, not just their output. You value them as a person, right?
Okay.
The leaders can embrace, that's the first thing, right? Like embrace this idea of like, these are people with real lives and not just cogs in the machine, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Leaders can also embrace fallibility by normalizing mistakes and learning from mistakes. So if a leader never shares struggles or failures, right, then workers learn that perfection is the only acceptable state, and they're afraid to speak up when they make a mistake. And then mistakes can fester and become bigger and bigger and bigger, right?
Yeah.
I've seen this happen within so many organizations, right?
Yeah.
Where there's this culture of perfectionistic standards that's too high. There's not psychological safety in the organization to come out in the open with when things go wrong, and then things just get worse.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So if leaders instead embrace learning from mistakes, now that doesn't mean like like you said, like there's a product that needs to be made, right?
Yep.
Like we have to have high standards, right?
Yep.
But oftentimes the best products come from learning about the mistakes that were made, in those prototypes, right?
Okay.
Like we have to be open about, what went wrong with this prototype to get to the next best prototype, right? To get to the best product. So I think the third recommendation would be, from these interviews that we did with leaders can help workers embrace agency by giving employee agency or autonomy over little things, right? Like obviously you can't give them autonomy over everything, right? But if there's some way that you could allow them some autonomy in their schedule, or it doesn't even have to be every week, right? Or providing choices about which task or which project they might want to take on, or, making themselves accessible and available for employees to share their voice.
Yeah.
Something as simple as an open door, right? Can cue or encourage agency.
Okay. My devil's advocate admits defeat. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would say too, it's important for leaders to look out for those employees who are engaged in like really harsh self-talk or overworking or catastrophizing errors, right? Like people who are isolating themselves or feeling like they need to be isolated for some reason, right? Like with all those combined, like these are red flags that someone could be trapped kind of in a maladaptive spiral, and they might be receptive to the leader or to other coworkers kind of cueing them to come out of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, and this is a great point. So even if you maybe aren't skilled on the cues, at least seeing them and saying like, oh, I think this person might be stuck, and now maybe get some help to help people kind of reverse this is really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. See, look at that. We came together. I appreciate that. Okay. We're gonna take ourselves out on this one. My last two questions I always like to ask all of my guests. The first is, what kind of phenomenon are you interested in now? Right. I think a lot of our research, and it sounds like with this, it's kind of there's a phenomenon out there that I think is interesting, or I can't explain, or I don't think there's a really good explanation.
Yeah.
And I think that ends up being the burst of curiosity. Well, so what are you curious about these days?
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious about a lot of things, but I think related to this research, right, I'm really fascinated by the growing tension between speed and precision in a lot of workplaces. So like as organizations are pushing for faster outputs powered by AI, or, we're seeing lots of different versions of AI, and, there's a lot of market competition there. The high value that we're putting on AI right now, I think employees are being compared to, AI output, right? Like their performance is being compared to this machine, right? So that to me is kind of interesting and fascinating. And I think it's going to increase this kind of focus of, or this feeling of high pressure to perform, right?
Okay.
And that tension feels like kind of a modern breeding ground for maladaptive perfectionism, unfortunately. So I'm intrigued by interventions that can help people shift from maladaptive to adaptive perfectionism. I think we need more of those. Yeah, as we're seeing this happen. Yeah.
Very cool. All right. And then last question, what are you reading for fun? No papers, no perfectionism books, no psychological safety papers. What are you reading for fun?
Okay, you might not laugh at this, but you might. I don't read for fun. I watch Netflix for fun.
Okay. All right.
But the two books that I just read, Collected Regrets by Clover by Mickey Brammer, which is about a death doula, which was it was fascinating to learn about this profession and kind of all the experience.
Is this the new qualitative paper you're working on? Are you going to be doing something on death doula?
No, but okay. Actually, these are book clubs that I belong to, and they don't they tend to be more like social justice books, right? And the other one, I was actually at a book club just before this interview where we were talking about Calling In by Loretta Ross, which I think is so needed right now. It talks about how, we tend to want to call people out all the time, especially on polarizing issues, but she takes you through these steps to try to call people in rather than call them out. But
calling them in. All right. I like it.
Yeah, but I am a fun person. I don't want you to think I'm not a fun person because I don't read fun books. Like I do enjoy
your political outreach and death. That's what you do in your fun. All right. Give me a Netflix thing you watched recently that was very enjoyable.
Okay, you're not going to think that this is fun either, but
if it's about death, we're really going to have to end this interview.
I mean, The Diplomat is kind of like therapeutic for me just because I can watch politics where like leaders are being somewhat rational and, I don't know. I feel like.
Do you think they're being rational in The Diplomat?
I mean,
that's actually saying something. I love The Diplomat.
More rational than what we're seeing going on right now.
I love that show. I have not seen the latest episode, the latest season, so no spoil. Did it come out?
But there's also a great Netflix, like a documentary and interview with Jane Goodall, kind of like her last words that she didn't want anybody to see. Until she had passed. I highly recommend. It was very cool.
Okay. All right. Well, that's you are fun. Rachel, don't let anyone tell you that you're not fun. Thank you so much for the time. It was great getting to talk to you about this research. I will be sharing this with my 12-year-old daughter so that she is understanding this and, maybe also getting the signs when maybe she's in a maladaptive versus an adaptive.
Yeah. I mean, on that note, you can tell her the story that kind of where I first recognized I had maladaptive perfectionism, which maybe this will get cut because we're already going over time. But I was auditioning for the School of American Ballet, which is one of the most prestigious ballet academies, when I was about her age. And I had made some tiny mistakes in the audition, but I was beating myself up in my head for these tiny mistakes and thinking, I really got to nail this last combination. The last combination had a big jump called the tour jeté, and I was really good at big jumps, right? So I went up for this huge jump and I fell flat.
Wow.
I fell hard and I was so embarrassed. I had so much shame. I had so much guilt. And yet I still got on the waiting list, right? But I couldn't. I was just ruminating so much about all the mistakes I had made and, how that pressure kind of got to me at the end of class. And I think that was kind of one of the moments where I realized this is affecting my performance. And I was really young. I couldn't, obviously process it the way I can now in retrospect. But yeah, you can tell her that story. You tell her, don't put pressure on yourself to nail everything, right? Because then it can affect your performance negatively.
She's gonna have to listen. She doesn't listen to me, so I'm gonna have to. I'm gonna have to let her play. I'm gonna play this podcast for her so she can hear from you.
I have a 14-year-old daughter. Same thing. Yeah.
Okay, so you get it. You get it.
Yeah,
All right.
Totally get it.
Thanks, Rachel. It was great talking.
All right, thank you.
All right, that's it for the Lit Review. I appreciate Rachel for her time, and I appreciate you all for listening. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the Lit Review podcast. You can find us by searching The Lit Review and AMJ Podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast platforms, as well as on the AMJ homepage. Thanks to the Academy of Management for their support of this podcast. Special thanks to my producer, Holly Fearing, for all of her work behind the scenes. Our theme music is produced by Key to Life. This is Sekou Burmese. See you next time. Take care and be good.